Well, thank you all for coming. I want to express my gratitude to Sonia and Nicole and Mitch at Innovation Edge for inviting me. Also to Indaba and the Walton Family Foundation for helping to support my 36 hours of travel to get here. Totally worth it. I want to tell you a little bit of a story to begin with. Okay, so the year is 1972. And at Stanford University, a psychology professor named Walter Mischel has designed a brilliant, although fairly simple experiment. The experiment involves having a child sit in a room where they're presented with a snack of their choice, a pretzel or a marshmallow. And they're told that they'll receive one marshmallow right away, but if they wait for the experimenter to come back, they'll receive 2 marshmallows. This is the famous, now well-known Marshmallow Test. People heard of this test before? Okay. So Walter Mischel's idea was to be able to see how well children were able to wait for something that was really pleasurable for them. And in the years since Mischel's original study, the extent to which children decided to and were able to wait has been linked to many things: how well children succeed in school, ultimately whether they do well on tests, whether they do well later in life. And this really was the starting point for this idea that not only is learning to read and write and do mathematics important, but also that social emotional functioning is a really important key to children's development. Now, one of the things that I think is really important that kind of got left behind in this message of the importance of social emotional development is that the original study really conveyed that it's sort of like whatever you have at the point where we test you is all you're going to have, that it's pretty well set. And that story has really been rewritten dramatically over the last 20 to 30 years with the advent of a number of techniques in modern neuroscience and brain science. So today, what I wanted to start with was to test your ability to withhold something that you would ordinarily do in order to see how well you're able to have self-control. And I did talk to the organizers about passing out marshmallows and seeing how long that you could wait for one or more, but they said it was too complicated. So instead, we're going to do a test called the Go, No, Go test, which is one that neuroscientists use a lot in laboratories to be able to test how well people are able to withhold a response when they're primed to do so. So here are the instructions. First of all, I want you to all pretend that you have a clicker that you're holding, okay? And after I tell you to do so, you're going to see a series of numbers on the screen. Push the clicker as quickly as you can when the number comes on the screen, except if it's the number 9. If it's the number 9, don't push the clicker at all. Are you ready? Okay, here we go. Oop, saw a lot of fingers move. How did you do? Not so good? It's a very hard test to do. Did you notice that not only were the numbers interspersed, but that you couldn't exactly predict when they were going to show up because we varied the amount of time, so you can't even get used to the pattern. Very difficult to do. We can measure the amount of activity in your brain in response to completing a task like this, and in particular, what happens all those times when you tried not to push the button, but a 9 showed up and you pushed it. And we do this by putting a net on the surface of your scalp that measures electrical activity in corresponding areas underneath the surface of your scalp where your brain is. When we do this in response to a computer task like the one I just showed, we can look at where the activity is happening at specific event intervals. So every time you accidentally push the button in response to 9, we can check out where there's electrical activity happening in the corresponding areas underneath these electrodes. And this has been done a number of times with the go, no, go task. And one of the things that's emerged as very clear is that when you make that mistake and you accidentally push the button, there's a burst of electrical activity in the front center of your brain in an area called the prefrontal cortex that corresponds to your brain saying, oh, I made a mistake and I need to change what I was doing or pay attention to what's going on. So that's this what's called event-related potential error-related negativity. So we can do this not only with adults, but in my laboratory for a number of years in collaboration with a number of colleagues, we can also do these kinds of tests with young children. Same procedures involve putting on this net that has the electrodes and then measuring brain activity in response to events that occur. With little children, we need to change the test to make it a little bit easier. So in the test that I'm going to show you now, which I won't make you do, we show children a white dot that comes on a screen. And we say, right after the white dot comes on the screen, there are going to be a series of colored circles that come on. They'll have a button box that we give them that has a green button and a red button. And what we tell them is, push the button that's the same color as the circle above the white dot. So you can see that on the left-hand side here, what a child will see is circles that are all the same color. Pretty easy for them to get that correct. But on the right-hand side, you can see instances where what the child will see is one color in the middle, but then it's surrounded by colored circles of the opposite color. It's much harder for young children to do this test, and they tend to make a lot of mistakes, just like you did pushing the button with the 9. In order to make it really clear to children how they're doing on this test, we also then give them feedback. So if they push the correct button, then a smiley face shows up on the screen, and if they push the wrong button, then a frowny face shows on the screen, the one on the bottom right. So I'll just show you what that looks like. This is my friend Andrew performing this test. So you can see he has the net on his head and some wires coming out of it, and then he's looking at the computer screen, pushing the buttons, and he gets a smiley face or a frowny face depending on whether he pushes the correct button or not. Pretty straightforward. In my laboratory, we studied the extent to which children who come from backgrounds where they've experienced a lot of stress early on in their lives, these are in particular children in our child protection system who are placed in foster care, what it looks like for them when they're doing this task and make a mistake. And if you look at same-age children, even children from lower income backgrounds, you see the exact pattern that I showed before, a burst of activity in the front of the brain when there's a mistake and they get the feedback. But this is what the foster children look like. So this is the signal, and this is actually over a period of less than a second. It's a very quick response. When the children perform the task and they get the correct answer, you get this little bit of activity. When they make an incorrect response, what you can see is there's no change in activity. There is not that burst of activity saying, something's going on, I need to do something different. I think this is a really vivid illustration of people talk about toxic stress and how it affects brain development. This is an example of how children who've experienced some kinds of toxic stress really show changes in how their brain operates. And if you think about this particular test, it's so critical. Think about situations for young children in school, with teachers, or even with peers where they're making mistakes and they're getting feedback that they make mistakes, and there's no additional activity in the brain saying, oop, time to correct. Imagine what kind of a challenge that would be for learning to get along with others, to follow the rules, and so forth. Really potentially quite devastating. This business of toxic stress affecting brain architecture has been something that we and many others have been studying for a long time. And it's not a simple story of anything difficult in the life of a child leads to negative outcomes. People are starting to find increasingly that there are different kinds of impacts that occur from different kinds of experiences. Two researchers, Margaret Sheridan and Katie McLaughlin, have really developed a beautiful model that suggests that there are different effects from threat-related experiences, things like trauma and abuse, which can actually lead to more rapid maturation of certain brain areas where you're focused on whether threatening things are happening all the time, versus toxic stress that's the result of the absence of supportive care where you really see deficits in more cognitive kinds of control that occur over time. Needless to say, some children have both threat and deprivation in their lives, but different kinds of experiences can really lead to different kinds of challenges that children face. And I think one thing that's so important to point out here is that oftentimes when we see children that are struggling in school or with peers or in their daily lives, we assume maybe it's just that they don't care. They don't have any good relationships with adults. We should really just figure that we can't do much to help them. But this suggests that these kinds of experiences really leave indelible footprints in terms of how children respond to the world around them in areas that if we can understand them better, we can really make a difference. So this leads to the whole question of how much plasticity is there in the brain, and should this be something that we're concerned about? I don't know if this is a popular term here in South Africa, but a lot of people in the US talk about rewiring the brain. Can the brain be rewired after it's sort of been set up by these kinds of experiences? One thing that I think is a theme that will occur consistently in this conference is that earlier is better. And indeed, the science shows conclusively, there's no question that trying to do things earlier makes the biggest difference, because that's when so much of the brain is really developing, especially in the first 3 years. You can think about it as sort of like as a metaphor for wiring a house. It's much easier to put the electrical system into a house when it's being built. You can determine where the wires are going. And similarly, early in life, the structure of the brain is forming, and it's really being laid down. It takes much more effort to change things, to change the wiring after the house is already built. You can still have changes, and in the context of brain functioning, you can have functional changes, but the structural changes are harder to impact. So that's one reason why it's really important that we focus on early. But having said that, I really want to emphasize that the story is not fully written after the first 3 years. I think one of the things that happens when early life becomes so important and gets onto the radar is people say, well, if we don't get there soon enough, then the story is written and it's all done. It turns out people used to talk about this idea of critical periods, that if things didn't happen at a certain time, there was no chance of them occurring. And you can see from this graph that there are certain kinds of areas of functioning, in particular sensory function, like hearing and seeing, that if you don't have the experience early on in life, you can't rebuild it, at least at this point with what we know from science. But higher level functions like language and cognition, first of all, they develop later in life. And the other thing that you can see from this slide is that the window never fully closes for those. It remains open. So the period of sensitivity may be at its greatest at earlier points in life, but still at later points in life, there's still plasticity in the brain. And there's increasingly evidence, and I think this is particularly relevant, that there are types of plasticity that occur in particular during adolescence, others that happen potentially around the birth of a child. And then, of course, we know in terms of brain plasticity that if people have had brain injuries or strokes, that they're still able to recover some function. So plasticity remains throughout the life. But it's important to begin to map out these periods where the greatest potential for change occurs, because those are areas where we have the greatest potential to make a difference. I just want to briefly also mention how this idea of plasticity in the brain relates to resilience. I think a lot of time when we talk about resilient children, resilient families or communities, we think about it as sort of a magical quality that some children have and some children don't. But the story of brain plasticity is the same as the story of resilience. You can think about it as like a scale where you're measuring things, and really the extent to which you'll see plasticity is the balance of positive influences, relationships, and events in a child's life or in an adult's life versus the negative things. The other thing that you can think about is that the experiences that they have may lead to the fulcrum, the triangle that holds the scale, shifting, so that positive things could actually count more if the circumstances are right. I also want to note, because I think sometimes with the science communication and the brain talk, we lose the question of, well, what can each of us do to really make a difference in children's lives? And the reality is that we know a lot about what makes a difference. The kinds of programs that make the biggest difference in children's lives are ones that emphasize three areas. They support responsive relationships in children, they reduce sources of this kind of toxic stress in children's lives, and they strengthen the very kind of core life skills that I was talking about at the beginning of this talk. Having said that, I want to point out that plasticity is something that remains possible even when children have had really difficult experiences. So I'll bring you back now to this test that we did with children, which is called the flanker test, where we gave them feedback after they got a correct answer or an incorrect answer. We have a program that we developed that involves 3 months of really intensive support for children in classroom settings before they start kindergarten. And we tested whether there are changes in children before and after they've received this program. So here you can see on this slide on the left-hand side that what we did was to look at the responses to the feedback before the intervention for a group of children on top who didn't get the program and a group of children on the bottom who did get the program. And you can see there was still no burst in electrical activity for children in both groups. After the period of time, this 3 months, we revisited the children who didn't receive the program, and you can see that there's still no change in the amount of electrical activity after feedback. However, drum roll, in children who received the program, you get the normal, typical amount of burst in the very area that you'd expected. And these children then subsequently went on to do much better in school in terms of their peer ratings and their teacher ratings. So this is a nice example of how the plasticity of the brain can really be leveraged in designing programs to help children who've had early stressful experiences. We have also developed programs that try to continue to leverage the activity or the plasticity of the brain across the lifespan. And one program in particular that we're most excited about is called the FIND program. What we do is to video children and adults interacting in natural settings, and we extract brief moments in which children are doing this serve and return process where they're engaging the world around them and adults are responding to the child. And we just show those brief instances broken down almost into like a greatest hits where we just break it down into small pieces. We find that in 10 weeks of that kind of coaching, where we're showing adults what they're doing correctly, we get a fundamental change in the amount of brain activity in the very area that's involved in self-control in the adults who are receiving this program. So again, the possibility to leverage the very plasticity of the brain, even in adults who are interacting with their children, is dramatic. And what's so powerful to me about these results and this program is that we're not training people to push a button correctly. That's what we test. But what we're training people to do is pause, wait, tune into their children, and focus on what their children are doing. And in that context, this natural environment of back and forth between parent and child, in only 10 weeks, we show a fundamental change in terms of more activity in the very area of the brain related to self-control. And actually, this may be relevant to some of you or not, the button pushing task is also something that we show dramatic improvements in during this video coaching, whereas those who don't receive it, we don't see the same effects. So I think this is just a nice demonstration of the potential of programs like this to really make a difference in children's lives. We have become big believers in video coaching, and I'm happy to talk more about it. We're implementing the program in many places, are really excited about having partners in other locations who try it out, so I'd be happy to talk to anybody at length about it during the course of the rest of the conference. But my main message to deliver here is that plasticity is possible. It's certainly critical that we get to supporting children and families as early in life as possible, but that we have the potential to continue to have an impact, and that we should be, as a result, incredibly optimistic about the potential of programs that we develop and put in place to lead to better outcomes for children and families. Thank you.